This is part 9 of Dawson, a series on the evolution of a fictional New England mill city utilizing real history. Last episode, we talked about the suburbanization and urban renewal in the Dawson metropolitan area. If you haven't listened to that, I recommend doing so. If you already have or just like to listen out of order, then welcome to the show. This is Dawson. I went to a high school with a large immigrant population. I didn't think anything of it. After all, my great-grandparents were immigrants. Around the area, I noticed that there was anxiety among the so-called natives of Lewiston. Growing up, I didn't understand that, because they were just like me, just with different skin. In the mid-1980s, the United States began to feel one of the greatest economic growth periods since the end of the Second World War. However, with every recession and economic growth period, they aren't always the case around the country. That shows in our mill cities. In Dawson, people who can afford to move out of downtown do so, and the rate that people move into downtown becomes stagnant. Since there are more people moving out of Dawson compared to those who are moving in, places become abandoned and squatters move into some of these places, and many become drug houses. These parts of downtown start to become hubs for crime activity. Other parts of downtown are more fortunate. Some apartment buildings are livable enough to house low-income residents who work at or near minimum wage. Because of the condition of downtown, Dawson becomes notorious. People who live here are often labeled as undesirables and are shunned throughout the state. White and Stanford profit off of this because they aren't Dawson. Companies move to these outer areas, suburbs continue to be built, and the average land values increase. The local officials in Dawson are not blind. They're aware of the crime in downtown and the reputation that the city has garnered. They want to do something about it. So they look backward to the only solution they know, and take a look at urban renewal again. In the early 1990s, the city officials unveiled a plan they call the Millennium Project. The plan is to raise over half of downtown for a new 4-lane road, and to replace triple-decker neighborhoods with strip malls, and housing projects akin to smaller versions of the modernist public housing projects in the 1950s, like Pruitt-Igoe. The low-income residents of Dawson wouldn't have this, many of whom already moved too many times from either building fires or evictions. In the real city of Lewiston, Maine, this did happen. The plan was called the Heritage Initiative. In both Lewiston and Dawson, the residents of downtown found out about this during a city council meeting. There's a documentary made by a Bates College student at the time the Heritage Initiative happened, called Neighbor by Neighbor, Mobilizing an Invisible Community in Lewiston, Maine. The synopsis of this movie is, quote, "In the summer of 2004, the mayor of Lewiston announced a plan to develop a 4-lane boulevard across downtown's low-income neighborhood. The plan was called the Heritage Initiative. Contrary to its name, this plan was going to eliminate the downtown's heritage by displacing 850 people from their homes, as well as destroy playgrounds, vegetable gardens, and historic buildings. Moving residents out of the city and improving traffic flow was at the heart of this proposal. It was 1960s urban renewal all over again. As tragic as the circumstances were, the threat of a road destroying the neighborhood required residents to rise to the challenge of becoming community organizers. Instead of allowing their neighborhood to be paved over, the residents of downtown organized themselves into a group called the Invisible Community. They received support from non-residents alike, social service leaders, college students, and other people who recognize a heritage initiative as an unfair way of cleaning up the downtown at the expense of people who lived there. What happened next was an incredible story of people coming together to protect their homes, hold their political leaders accountable, and work toward creating a democratic planning process that honored the input of low-income people as much as any other person's voice. This movie documents 5 years of development and community organizing in Lewiston, Maine. It reveals the strategies, the mistakes, the prejudices, the lessons, all of the difficult stuff that make up the political process. The act of making decisions and setting policy together." End quote. In Lewiston, the community organizers were able to put a hold on the project and save downtown from being torn down. Now, the Heritage Initiative lives only in the documentary, city archives, and the memory of those who followed it. Around this era, we begin to see a new community arrive in Dawson from Somalia. For context, we have to go back to the 1960s. After the colonial territories of Italian and French Somalia merged to form the Somali Republic, tensions erupted between Somalia and Ethiopia, a land previously colonized by France, where the Somalian government sought to regain pre-colonial territory that was given to Ethiopia from French colonization. In 1969, the president was assassinated, and General Said Barre staged a military coup that successfully seized control of the government. He then dissolved the parliament and announced the constitution, and with funding from the Soviet Union, grew the military and invaded Ethiopia. On the other hand, the Soviet Union gave Ethiopia even more military support, so Barre was defeated. After the failures of Barre's government and destabilization, various rebel groups toppled his government in 1991. With no government or any single stable power, rebel groups turned to fight each other for the control of Somalia. Over the next few years, drought, famine, and the impending doom from the civil war forced many Somalis to flee the country. One place that many of refugees from Somalia began was a Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya. This camp started seeing large numbers of refugees in 1991 and was built at a capacity for 90,000. By 2012, Dadaab was home to over 460,000. That's bigger than New Orleans. If you look at aerial images of the camp, it looks almost like a suburb outside a major city because it spreads as far as the eye can see. For refugees, you're lucky if you make it out, because some people that live there to this day have still lived there since it began. In her book, One Goal, author and professor of history Amy Bass describes the very real journey for a refugee who ended up in Lewiston, Maine. Quote, "For Abdikadir Nagier, each part of the journey from Somalia to Maine remains all too vivid. Nagier fled Somalia with his parents when he was 5 years old. Thousands took the journey. Days of walking toward the Kenyan border, losing older and weaker family and friends along the way. Hiding from animals and rogue armed militia. Little food and even less water. Nagier barely remembers Somalia, but the Kenyan refugee camps where he lived for 14 years remained rooted deeply in his mind. His family of 12 lived in a one-room hut with a plastic-covered roof. He remembers the long lines of grain rations and the cries of hungry children with a constant burning in their bellies. On the days that they had breakfast, there was no lunch or dinner. Thieves preyed upon their rations. It was dark at night, and with darkness came danger. Nagier took classes, trying to learn English as best he could, hoping if they were ever resettled in the United States, he would be able to speak the language and help his family. And he played soccer to help pass the long years of waiting for their life to begin. After 10 years in Dadaab, Nege's family moved to Kakuma, a standard procedure in Bantu resettlement. After 4 years in Kakuma, Nege's family headed for Georgia, where everything from the brightest lights to the language seemed strange. Despite his English lessons, Nege couldn't navigate the southern accent. His first day in Decatur, he tried running errands for his parents. He couldn't understand the woman at the grocery. Her words didn't sound like the ones he knew. In April 2006, the family decided to move to Lewiston. They'd been in Decatur only a few months when his older sister, who left Georgia to find them a better place to live, called. Lewiston, she told them, was the place. They'd have Somali neighbors, she said. End quote. You can just imagine how tiring it must be to move from country to country, state to state, and town to town for the first 15 to 20 years of your life. When Somali refugees started arriving in Dawson, they were met with a mixed response. In 2002, the mayor of Lewiston, Larry Raymond, penned an open letter to the Somali community in Lewiston telling them to stop immigrating to the city. This caught the attention of national newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and subsequently, white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups. There's a fascinating documentary called The Letter about this. Right before the Somali refugees arrived, the September 11th attacks occurred. Because of that, a lot of people were angry and many blamed anyone that practiced Islam. These neo-Nazi groups staged rallies and protests in Lewiston. Most, if not all, of the neo-Nazis were from other parts of the country, Illinois in one example. The residents of Lewiston and students at Bates College staged counter-protests. It almost got violent, but thankfully never reached that critical point. Over time, the apartment buildings downtown that used to be empty were quickly and cheaply renovated so that the refugees have a place to live. The refugees also began opening small businesses in what were once empty spots, and the area gets nicknamed as Little Mogadishu, just like how French-Canadian immigrants had Little Canada. Thanks for watching or listening to the 9th episode of Dawson. If you like this, please consider subscribing so you can be the first to know when episode 10, the finale, drops. And leave a like to show your support. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at the handle UnnamedWithMatt, on Reddit in r/unnamednarrative, and if you would like to get in touch with me directly, you can email me at unnamednarrative@gmail.com.